Hi everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Lessons from Capablanca. Today we're going to go through the age-old debate of bishop versus knight. In his book, when talking about the relative value of the pieces, Capablanca states, "For all general theoretical purposes, the bishop and the knight have to be considered as of the same value, though it is my opinion that the bishop will prove a more valuable piece in most cases, and it is well known that two bishops are almost always better than two knights. The bishop will be stronger against pawns than the knight, and in combination with pawns will also be stronger against the rook than the knight will be. A bishop and a rook are also stronger than a knight and a rook, but a queen and a knight may be stronger than a queen and a bishop." It's interesting to note that Capablanca is credited as the first person to point this out, and indeed statistics have proved that it's true. He goes on to say, "A bishop will often be worth more than 3 pawns, but a knight very seldom so, and may not even be worth so much. 2 bishops are enough to force mate, whereas 2 knights are not, except for very exceptional circumstances. A king and 2 knights cannot force mate, unless the opponent makes a mistake. The position before us here can be won by white, and the reason is because of the black pawn here on h5. And whether or not it's white to play, he wins. Let's say it is white to move, so now comes... the knight was here to begin with. So now comes knight g6, and h4 from black, and white can't take the pawn, or now black will be able to make a draw from the game. And the correct move is knight e5, and now h3, and if at any stage black moves his king instead, then white can still force mate in the same way as he will here. So knight c6, and now black can't move his king, so h2 is forced. And now comes knight b5, and again the black king can't move, so h1 queen is forced. And note here that if black didn't have a pawn to move, it would be stalemate. So h1 queen, and now knight c7 is mate. And Capablanca writes, "The reason for this peculiarity in chess is evident. White with the 2 knights can only stalemate the king, unless black has a pawn which can be moved." Okay, on to the next example. And here, although he is a bishop and a pawn ahead, this position cannot be won by white. Capablanca writes, "It is the greatest weakness of the bishop that when the a or h pawn queens on a square of the opposite color and the opposing king is in front of the pawn, the bishop is absolutely worthless. All that black has to do is to keep moving his king close to the corner square." So just keep it, right up in the corner. Okay, so here's the next example, and it's black to move. Which side do you think stands better? The answer is white, and in fact it's a force mate in a maximum of 5 moves. The best and most tricky way for black to continue is with king h2. So now comes knight g4 check, and king h1 is the only move. And then king f1 and g5, which is the best response, the only other possibility being h2, and then knight f2 is mate. So g5, king f2, h2, knight e3, forcing g4 because again the black king can't move. Now knight f1, forcing g3 check, and now knight takes g3 as mate. And Capablanca writes, "Now that we have seen these exceptional cases, we can analyze the different merits and the relative value of the knight and bishop. It is generally thought by amateurs that the knight is the more valuable piece of the two, the chief reason being that, unlike the bishop, the knight can command both black and white squares. However, the fact is generally overlooked that the knight at any one time has the choice of one color only. It takes much longer to bring a knight from one wing to the other. Also, as shown in the following example, a bishop can stalemate a knight, a compliment which the knight is unable to return." And that's in this situation here. And now comes bishop d3, which is a little trick worth knowing, especially for minor piece endgames, because now the knight has no moves, the bishop is covering all of them. And this applies whenever there's a knight on the edge of the board and there's a space of 2 squares and then a bishop of the opponent's. And in order to solve this problem, black would have to bring his king over to protect one of these squares so the knight can move to it, and in the meantime the white king can move up and take these pawns. And Capablanca continues on the subject of knights versus bishops with: the weaker the player, the more terrible the knight is to him, but as a player increases in strength, the value of the bishop becomes more evident to him, and of course there is, or should be, a corresponding decrease in his estimation of the value of the knight as compared to the bishop. In this respect, as in many others, the masters of today, i.e. 1921, when this book was written, are far ahead of the masters of former generations. While not so long ago some of the very best amongst them, like Pillsbury and Chigorin, preferred knights to bishops, there is hardly a master of today who would not completely agree with the statements made above, and indeed this remains the case in 2009, perhaps even more so. Okay. And this is about the only case when the knight is more valuable than the bishop. It is what's called a blocked position, and all the pawns are on one side of the board. If there were pawns on both sides of the board, then there would be no advantage in having a knight. In such a position, black has excellent chances of winning. Of course, there is an extra source of weakness for white in having his pawns on the same colour squares as his bishop. This is a mistake often made by players. The proper way, generally, in an ending, is to have your pawns on opposite squares to that of your bishop. When you have your pawns on squares of the same colour, the action of your bishop is limited by them, and consequently the value of the bishop is diminished, since the value of a piece can often be measured by the number of squares it commands. While on the subject, I shall also call attention to the fact that it is generally preferable to keep your pawns on squares of the same colour as that of the opposing bishop, particularly if they are passed pawns supported by the king. The principles might be stated thus: when the opponent has a bishop, keep your pawns on squares of the same colour as your opponent's bishop. Whenever you have a bishop, whether the opponent also has one or not, keep your pawns on squares of the opposite colour to that of your bishop. Naturally, these principles have sometimes to be modified to suit the particulars of the position. For example, in endings of opposite coloured bishops and pawns, which is just about the only example of when you should have your pawns on the same colour square as those which your bishop is controlling. In the following position, the pawns are on one side of the board, and there is no advantage in having either a knight or a bishop. The game should surely end in a draw. Now, with pawns on both sides of the board, it is preferable to have the bishop, although the position, if properly played out, should end in a draw. The advantage of having the bishop lies as much in its ability to command, at long range, both sides of the board from a central position, as in its ability to move quickly from one side of the board to the other. In this position, it is unquestionably an advantage to have the bishop because, although each player has the same number of pawns, they are not balanced on each side of the board. Thus, on the king's side, white has 3 to 2, while on the queen's side, it is black who has 3 to 2. Still, with proper play, the game should end in a draw, though white has somewhat better chances. Here is a position in which to have the bishop is a decided advantage, since not only are there pawns on both sides of the board, but there is a passed pawn for both sides also. Black should have extreme difficulty in drawing this position, if he can do it at all. So these are, important factors to take into account considering the pawn structure in the middle game and whether you want to trade a knight for a bishop, in the opening or in the middle game. You should try and see all the way to potential endgames if it's possible. And the last example. Again, black would have great difficulty in drawing this position. The student should carefully consider these positions. I hope that many examples will help him to understand, in their true value, the relative merits of the knight and bishop. As to the general method of procedure, a teacher or practical experience will be best. I might say generally, however, that the proper course in these endings is advance of the king to the centre of the board or towards the passed pawns, or pawns that are susceptible of being attacked, and rapid advance of the passed pawn or pawns as far as it is consistent with their safety. To give a fixed line of play would be folly. Each ending is different and requires different handling according to what the adversary proposes to do. Calculation by visualizing the future positions is what will count. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it enjoyable and instructive. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.